Hello, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Mirtarin Chaya Paramasaputra with NPM 180-410-2000002. Today, I'm going to have a presentation for a literature and film final project, and I will discuss Frank Herbert's most famous novel, Dune, and its movie adaptation. So let's get started. First of all, let's talk about Chapman's theory about what novels can do that films cannot. So it has a correlation with the narratives and narratology. Narratology itself comes from the French term la narratologie and means that the study of narratives. Narratology has taught us that narrative has its own independent structure no matter what medium is being used to convey the narrative. Chapman describes narrative as a kind of text organization. Narratives have a double time structuring. That means that narratives always operate with and in two times: the time sequence of the plot, which is the story time, and the time when in the text those plot events are presented, which is discourse time. So far, most narratology has focused on how narratives are the same despite the medium in which they are presented, especially the written word versus film, works differently when presenting the same narrative. In the written text, the number of details are limited, and the reader expands on these details through imagination. In the visual text, there are many more details, but the details are not asserted by a narrator. Since the details are not brought in a limited way to our attention, we only focus on them if they are related, obviously, to the plot and what might happen next. Chapman anticipates some counterpoints to this argument, such as the camera style of writing and close-ups and stabilizing shots in film, but says that the difference is still that in movies the sense of continuing action doesn't stop. Another difference between the two mediums is how a narrator or speaker in a written text can reveal a lot about himself or herself and larger society and setting by what he or she is saying. Chapman claims that the camera cannot evoke a tone in the same way. In film, the visual point of view cannot be escaped, while in written text, the author has more freedom and flexibility. The filmmaker can evoke emotion and subtleties, and in the narrative, visually, such as through camera placement without speaking or asserting, give us light commentary on what's happening in the society on screen. Now, let's move on to how Frank Herbert's most known work, Dune, adapted to the big screen. Dune was adapted from the 1965 novel by Frank Herbert. There are 6 original books by Frank Herbert and 19 plus volumes in the prelude series written by Herbert's son, Brian and Kevin J. Anderson. There are 2 major adaptations of the first novel that can actually make it to the screen. They are David Lang's Dune 1984 and Denis Villeneuve's new pandemic-delayed release starring Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya in 2021. Now, how did the time at adapting Dune went? Are there any struggles the filmmakers faced during the process? Well, over the 56 years of its existence, Dune has earned a reputation for being unfilmable. But that's not the most accurate way to describe the continuing struggles that filmmakers have faced in bringing the books to the screen. An unfilmable project is something like a book that has specifically crafted for its medium and cannot be transferred to another one and removed from its prose and structure without losing most of it and not all of what made it compelling. Dune isn't so much unfilmable as it's uncontainable. The major stumbling block for everyone who has tried hasn't been a matter of how to bring it to the screen, but how much of its almost 500 pages, not including the appendixes, they can and should include. Not to mention how best to balance the characters' perspectives, backstory, plot spine, concepts, themes, and personal touches that make the cut. Now let's talk about the biggest changes and mistakes in the early movie adaptation of the year 1984. David, David Lang's 1984 adaptation of Frank Herbert's seminal sci-fi novel Dune mirrored its source material in admirable ways, but a string of deviations have irked critics and purists for over 3 decades. Lang's 1984 adaptation necessarily made some changes to the original book in order to translate the epic story for the silver screen. Many discrepancies occurred in the 1984 Dune adaptation. Among them are that this adaptation changed characters and visuals. Characters from the original book were brought to life, but in some cases they were updated, altered, or changed by the director, who is known for being weird, surreal, and unsettling. In Dune's larger roles, Kylie MacLachlan and Sting were cast as much as older variation of Paul Atreides and Fit Rotha Harkonnen, who in the novel are mere teenagers. The Reverend Mothers of the Bene Gesserit are supplied a weird edge by being completely bald. The mutants feature large, somewhat goofy-looking eyebrows, and the Harkonnens are presented as exclusively redheads, with chests that can be graphically unplunged by use of hard black. And also the plot structure in Dune 1984 is completely different. The novel Dune includes an index for readers to reference for its terminology. The film obviously finds an alternative means of setting up the complicated plot. Essential information about the Space Guild, the spies, the Fremen, and their prophecy is front-loaded and crisscrossed in an opening narration, appropriately delivered by Princess Ilorin, who introduced segments in the novel, which continues in the form of a secret report from within the Guild, where the central planets Khitan, Caladan, and Gidi Prime are laid out and nicely contrasted. Additionally, vital characters from Dune the novel are introduced, but their importance to the overall narrative is unclear in the film, with some randomly disappearing part way through with no explanation provided. And last but not least, Dune 1984 changes ideas, themes, and atmosphere. Outside of character and structure, the fan's biggest gripe with Lang's Dune is undoubtedly its removal of the prana bindu training, like the high-speed martial arts that Paul and the Fremen use. Providing style removed, the filmmakers concerned that Dune would resemble a martial art film, yet fans have constantly criticized the movie's sonic projectiles, especially since the hand-to-hand combat is so essential to the novel's premise. For a more streamlined adaptation, the ecological, politic, and religious aspect of Dune were all dwindled or removed completely. Okay, let's move on now to how about the last adaptation of Dune? The new Denis Villeneuve movie Dune is vastly more successful than the earlier adaptation of the story. A television writer and producer, Andrea Kella, says, "It lived up to every single one of my expectations. It was exactly what I was hoping for in an adaptation of one of my favorite books of all time." Then also Geek's Guide to the Galaxy host David Bartley agrees that Dune is a first-rate adaptation. "It's just so nice to have science fiction movies made by people who actually respect the source material," he says. In contrast to the 80s, where so often they would take a book and the director would just like, "I have so many better ideas than this stupid book," and they would change everything. Also, fantasy author Rajan Khan enjoyed the film but wishes it had included more of the novel's rich world building. A lot of the weird stuff got skipped, and those stuff being given minimal exposure in this film was a disappointment to me, because I think one of the great things about the novel is the weird stuff that he comes up with, he says. And later on, science fiction author Matthew Kressel is hopeful that an extended edition of Dune might restore some of his favorite scenes from the book. He also excited to see more of the Dune universe in the upcoming sequel Dune, which is the part 2. This was the Dune film that I've wanted for so long, he says, and I'm excited about the sequel. It's a long time to wait, but we waited long enough for this one, so I can't wait another year or two, he said. Alright, I personally also agree with all of them because Dune is one of the greatest work of all time, and all failures of some its movie adaptation is disappointed, of course, but it makes it clear that Dune has a high level of narrative and plot which can confuse many people or even filmmakers. So if there's any successful movie adaptation of Dune, it'll be so amazing and such a groundbreaker. And I really put a big expectation on the sequel of the movie Dune 2021 edition, which is will be coming very soon. Because the story from the last movie kind of not finished, and it's like being parted. And I think the sequel would contain the rest of the story and would be more successful than its prequel. Okay, I think that's the information that I can bring and provide through this presentation. Now we've come to the end, and thank you for your time and have a great day.